Hello, this is Juliana Michaels. Welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm going to share 3 of my favorite techniques. First, I'm going to show you how to watercolor the main image using Distress Watercolor Pencils, and then how to create the background using Distress Oxide inks and Embossing Glaze. To get started with this card, I'm going to begin with a piece of Distress Watercolor cardstock. I've placed it inside my stamping platform, and for this technique, you're going to want to use one if you have it. If you don't, it's not the end of the world and you can still get a great result without it, but it does add to the look. After I place my paper in the stamping platform, I'm going to double check and make sure that it's pushed tightly into the corner. This is important to make sure you can line it up when we re-stamp the image later on. Next, I'm inking up the inspector image with black soot archival ink and stamping the image onto the cardstock. With the stamping completed, I'm ready to begin watercoloring the image using Distress Watercolor Pencils. The colors I'll be using are Faded Jeans, Prize Ribbon, Fired Brick, Black Soot, Peeled Paint, Fossilized Amber, Wild Honey, Antique Linen, Tattered Rose, and Kitsch Flamingo. I'll also be using a water brush, but you can certainly use a paintbrush and water, and a paper towel to wipe off and clean my brush in between colors. When I use the Distress Watercolor Pencils, I prefer to pull the color directly from the pencils using the water brush instead of coloring on the paper and then blending it. I find this gives the smoothest coverage and avoids causing any pencil marks. If you don't have the pencils, another option would be to use Distress ink pads and smush the color onto your craft mat and pick it up with the brush. I'm going to begin on the skin, and here I'm starting with Antique Linen. I find it to be a great first layer, and when I'm watercoloring, I like to start with the lightest color. Once I get this color down, I'm going to add some Tattered Rose to the areas of shadow. I clean off my brush on a paper towel before beginning the new color. Figuring out the areas of shadow is easy to determine on this sort of image because the stamp already has them as part of the design. Just add the darker color to the darker parts on the image. Next, I'm adding a bit of pink to the cheeks and lips using Kitsch Flamingo. I also add more Antique Linen and Tattered Rose here and there to make the colors slightly darker. Before I continue on, I'm going to dry the ink using my heat tool. And then I'm going to grab a sip of coffee to keep me going. Here I'm coloring in his eyes using peeled paint. In the end, you can't quite see his eye color, but the tiny details matter, right? Next, I'm going to color in his hat and coat. Here I'm going to start with Faded Jeans and color in the entire area. Before I continue, I'm going to dry this color with my heat tool. Now I'm using Prize Ribbon as my darker color and to add the shadows to the hat and coat. Remember, you can always start off with less color on your brush and add more as you go to build up the color. You might also notice me dabbing the color off onto my craft mat or onto the paper towel. I do this when I feel like I have either too much water or too much color on the brush. For the detail on his hat, I'm using Fired Brick. I'm starting off with less color and more water to get a lighter color. I then dry it and add another layer of color and then another to gradually get a darker color for the shadows. I seriously love that I can color in such small areas, not waste any ink, and everything matches since it's all part of the Distress palette. The next color is Black Soot. I'm using it to color in the band on his hat, his hair, his stash, and the goggles. I'm also using it to add to the shadows on his coat. I then grab Prize Ribbon and add some more color to the hat and coat as well. As you can see, it's just a process of building up color slowly until you are satisfied with how it looks. The final bit of coloring I do is to use fossilized amber and wild honey to color in the buttons and his goggles. I end up adding gilded foundry wax to make them look like metal, and I'll be showing you that next. But if you don't have this wax, you can simply color these in with the pencils and it still looks great. As I mentioned, I'm going to use gilded foundry wax to make the buttons and trim around the goggles look like metal. To do this, I'm going to use a tiny paintbrush to apply the wax. Before using the wax, I make sure to shake it until the mixing ball rattles so that the color is well blended. After putting a small drop of the wax on my craft mat, I add a tiny drop of isopropyl alcohol. This helps to thin the wax and slows the dry time down just a tiny bit. I then paint on the wax. Now it's time for the magic to happen, but before I grab my embossing heat gun, I make sure to move the bottle of foundry wax out of the way so that it doesn't accidentally get heated. This can ruin the wax. Here I'm using my embossing heat gun to heat the wax. This makes the wax permanent, and as you can see, takes it from dull to shiny like metal. With all the coloring completed, it's time to place the image back inside my stamping platform. I make sure to push it tightly into the corner and use an extra magnet to hold it in place. I then re-ink the stamp and stamp the image. As you can see, you lose some of the detail of the stamped image when you color it with the watercolor pencils. You can see that in the image here on the left. When you restamp it, it really brings all the detail back, as you can see here on the right. However, if you don't have a stamping platform, you can certainly skip this step and it still looks quite good. The next step for this part is to fussy cut the inspector using a pair of scissors, but I'm going to spare you this part as I want to get into how I created the background for this card. To create the background, I'm going to do one of my favorite techniques. It's called Stamp and Smudge. You will need some stamps. I'll be working with the inspector, creative blocks, and note quotes from the latest release. White cardstock. I prefer Distress Watercolor paper for this technique. A paper towel or rag, and several colors of Distress Oxide inks. The colors I'm using are Faded Jeans, Aged Mahogany, Rustic Wilderness, and Frayed Burlap. I picked these colors because I used similar colors to them when I colored the inspector. Distress Oxide inks are the ink of choice for this technique because the ink doesn't dry immediately when you stamp it. And I'm going to be working on a piece of Distress Watercolor paper cut to 4 by 5 1/4 inches. The first color I'm using is Frayed Burlap. I apply the ink and stamp the image. Here I'm checking to see if it's wet enough, and I decide to re-ink and stamp the image again. Sometimes with a newer stamp or a drier ink pad, you may need to stamp twice to get good ink coverage and to make sure the ink stays wet on the paper. This is where having a stamping platform can be really helpful. After stamping the image, I take the paper towel and lightly rub over the wet ink to smudge it. Hence the name Stamp and Smudge. I just love the distressed effect it creates. For this next image, I'm using a stamping block, and I wish I had used my platform so I could restamp it, but I'm still able to smudge the ink somewhat, so it's fine. I do, however, switch back to my stamping platform for the rest of the stamping. Next, I'm going to add a few detail images using archival ink in Vintage Photo. I like to do a little bit of this to add in a mix of images that aren't distressed. I personally like the look that they add to the overall design, but you could do the stamp and smudge with these as well if you like. When I'm creating a collage stamped background like this, I always try to place the images with the same colors in a visual triangle with each other so that your eye moves across the card to look for the same colors. The next color I'm stamping with is Faded Jeans. A few tips with this technique so that you don't smudge the image and lose all the details is to make sure the ink isn't too wet. So if an image is solid or has a solid area that holds a lot of ink, I like to dab off some of that wet ink before I start smudging. I can't remove excess ink once it's there, but by using a stamping platform, I can always add more ink if there isn't enough. After faded jeans, I move on to aged mahogany and repeat the process of stamping and smudging. Another tip if you're trying to figure out where to stamp the different colors is to plan out their placement. To do this, simply lay the stamps out on the card front that you want to stamp with the same color. This way you can see if you have them spread out in a visual triangle and you can move them before you commit to stamping them. The final color I'm working with is Rustic Wilderness. Once I stamp these images, I decide to fill in a couple of open spots with some of the playing card symbols. Now I'm going to do a bit more stamping with the open circle shape from the Note Quote stamp set using frayed burlap. Here I'm using a stamping block to save some time since I'm stamping the same image more than once. And of course I'm smudging the ink after I stamp each image. The final step is to ink the edges with walnut stain distress ink using a foam blending tool. I tap off a bit of the excess ink onto my craft mat and then drag the ink onto the paper in a circular motion. Here I'm just adding it to the edges to get them nice and dark, and then I repeat the inking around the edge just to darken it up a little more. I have one more step before the background is complete, and before I do that, I want to make sure the ink is completely dry. I'm using a heat tool to speed up the process, but you can also let it air dry. The next technique is always a favorite of mine. I'm going to add some more interest to the background with a stencil and embossing glaze. There are 3 new stencil designs with this release. I'm going to use the brush arch from the mini stencil set 55. Before I begin, I'm rubbing an anti-static pouch over the paper. This is just one more step you can do besides making sure the ink is completely dry to make sure the embossing glaze only sticks where you want it. Next, I'm placing the stencil on the background and using a sponge dauber to apply Distress embossing ink through the stencil. I apply some ink to the upper left-hand side and the bottom right-hand side. I then remove the stencil and place it to the side to clean up later. Before I apply the embossing glaze, I place the paper on top of a piece of printer paper folded in half. The embossing glaze color I'm using is Lost Shadow, and I'm just pouring it over the ink. I pick up the card background and tap off the excess powder. This is where the folded paper helps out. You can use it to easily pour the excess powder back into the jar. A Swiffer duster helps to wipe away any excess that may have gotten on my work surface. And if you've ever worked with embossing powder, you know it gets everywhere no matter how careful you are. The final step is to use my embossing heat gun to melt the embossing glaze. I never ever tire of watching embossing powders melt and turn shiny. It's like magic to me. Here's a look at the completed card. Some final touches include adding glossy accents to the goggles to make them look like glass. This of course takes some time to dry, so you might want to do this before you do the final assembly. Another thing I did was to add the text across the bottom of the card. This was stamped with vintage photo archival ink and the edges inked with walnut stain distress ink. I added some hardware heads to the ends of it that I colored with gilded foundry wax so that they would match the inspector. I adhered the fussy cut inspector and the text strip to the card front using double-sided foam adhesive for a bit of dimension. To complete the card, I inked the edges of a piece of Distress white heavy stock cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches with walnut stain distress ink. And there you have it. 3 of my favorite techniques all in one card. I hope you enjoyed the process, and I'll see you next time. Thanks so much for watching. I'm truly grateful for you. I was wondering if you could do me a quick favor and subscribe to my channel or leave me a thumbs up or a comment. If you're feeling extra generous, I'd love for you to share about my channel with your friends. All of these things help out us YouTubers so much, and it would mean so much to me to have your support.